very, very important, we believe, event with extraordinary guests that have been kind enough to join us today to talk about the ongoing and, most importantly, future U.S.-China relationship. My name is Paolo von Schirach, and I am the president of the Global Policy Institute, a think tank in downtown Washington, D.C., and at the same time, I'm privileged to be the chair of political science and international relations at the Atlantic University, also located in downtown Washington, D.C., and working closely with GPI. Today, as you all know, having responded to our invitation, we're going to talk about the China challenge and how the brand new, freshly installed Biden administration is going to cope with it. And of course, why are we talking about China? Because clearly there seems to be, oddly enough, bipartisan agreement. And I stress, believe it or not, because there is hardly any bipartisan agreement on anything in Washington, probably not on the time of day, between Democrats and Republicans. But there seems to be significant convergence between the Democrats now in the majority and Republicans that led, obviously, the previous administration, that China represents a real problem, not a nuisance, not something to worry about maybe every other, on weekends, but the looming large is a challenge, or perhaps a systemic threat, an existential threat, maybe if we want to be more extreme, and that this requires, as we say here in Washington, an all of government, thinking and response, because the challenge is multi-dimensional. We're talking about trade. We're talking about who's going to be the leader of technology, about regional influence of China in Asia and beyond. We're talking about the growth, the significant growth of the reach and capabilities of Chinese military, and on and on. And there's Hong Kong, and there's Taiwan. There's so much to talk about. So I don't want to steal time from our distinguished guests. We've got with us Gordon Chang and Brandon Weichert and my old friend Martin Seif. So all of them very seasoned observers of international affairs and China in particular. Gordon has written many books on the topic. He has firsthand knowledge, and so do the others. So why don't we just start with this simple but critical question? Is it proper? Just obviously, we assume that the way the issue has been framed by both the Trump administration and now the new Biden administration, that it is correct to say that China represents a real challenge, not to the United States, to the Western system, to the rules-based international order created after World War II, from the Bretton Woods institutions, and our idea of order and freedom-based prosperity. That's the way things used to be. Now China seems to operating in a different way, and so the question is, and I start with you, Gordon. Given this adversarial relationship, what are the strengths and weaknesses of each side? What would you say that we should be focusing on? Because there's so much to talk about that we may get lost, losing, the fundamentals. To you, Gordon.
Well, China is moving to a neo-totalitarian state, and that's both its greatest strength and its greatest weakness. Because what you have right now in China is a leader who looks to be secure. He is implementing multi-decade plans. He's got resources to do that. And so that, of course, means that he can accomplish what he sets out to do. But of course, as we've seen in the context of the Cold War and at other times in history, when you have regimes like that, they can go off the rails. And that's especially true in China's history as well, going back to its imperial past. So when you look at China, I think the most important thing is its form of governance being both a strength and a weakness. And it's becoming, just on balance, I think, more of a weakness because Xi Jinping is pushing the country in directions that are not in China's best interests and certainly not in the best interests of the world.
Okay, and coming to us, the United States, how do you view our, strengths and weaknesses at this time?
Well, our greatest weakness is that we do not fundamentally understand the maliciousness of the Chinese regime. And so therefore, we have a president who talks about China being a quote unquote competitor. Well, yes, it's a competitor, but it's also an enemy. And we know that because China itself has called us an enemy. May 2019, going back to People's Daily, the most authoritative publication in China, declared a quote unquote people's war on the US. And indeed, we have seen attacks which are ferocious. So for instance, last year and this year, China has been trying to foment violence on American streets. And this goes beyond just mere attempts at competition. It goes beyond subversion. This is an act of war, and we don't realize that. China deliberately spread the coronavirus. That's now, 472,000 American dead. China sells fentanyl purposefully to kill Americans. You just go down the list. We do not understand how this regime is just so malign. And because of that, they can actually win. They're a much weaker state than we are from many different perspectives. But nonetheless, China can actually overthrow the US government because we're not defending ourselves adequately.
And our strengths, what would they be?
Well, we're just across the board a much stronger society. We've got a more resilient form of governance. We've got a larger economy. We've got a sustainable economy because we don't really have to sell to the rest of the world. On balance, that sort of weakens us. We're very creative, very innovative. So we're an open society, and that's all the strengths of that. We're just much larger. We've got more friends. You just go down the list. China, yes, of course, is making advances, but nonetheless, when you look at all of these areas, we're far ahead of China. But as I said, that might not matter because China could divide the U.S. and could cause the turmoil that we have seen recently, aggravating it, and that could lead to the destruction of us as a free society. Remember, China doesn't believe in the Westphalian system. It believes in the Tianxia, or mandate of heaven, where Chinese rulers have the mandate of heaven over the entire world. And so, yeah, this is a fundamental challenge, but it's more than that. We're in a struggle which approximates war.
Yes.
Well, thank you for that, Brandon. So malicious regime that we don't quite understand, the depth of their bad intentions towards us, and that, of course, know your enemy should be the very first step, a rule of any engagement, right?
Of course.
Do you agree, or do you have a different take on this, Brandon?
No, I agree. I think Gordon laid it out very well. I would say that the single greatest threat that China poses to us for now is still the sort of economic domain. And this is something that, unfortunately, we're not accustomed to dealing with. The last kind of real economic competitor we had to face would either have been the old British Empire, which we ultimately displaced, thankfully peacefully, or even you could argue the Third Reich, or the Germans, which of course was not very peaceful. But with the Soviet Union, which is the closest analog our policymakers have to trying to shape how we're going to compete with China, they were never integrated the way that the Chinese have been integrated into the world economy. And China is allowed to gain access to critical technology. This is my area, is sort of the confluence of emerging tech and national security. China is able to gain access to emerging technologies at the same rate that we are because they're part of the global economic system. They're, our universities partner with Chinese universities routinely to do sensitive research and development programs, the kind of programs that we used to do here but don't really do anymore for various reasons. And so that's the real threat right now. What will happen eventually is that once China becomes the new innovation hub, which is what they are very seriously committed to doing, once they pull in all the Western capital and the Western talent they can, they will then have a base within China, much the same way that they pulled manufacturing capabilities from the West. They will then have the base to do high-tech R&D in China itself, and that's how they plan on leapfrogging us. Now, they're able to do this for some of the reasons that Gordon touched upon, which is basically they don't have the kind of disagreements in their society that we do. They certainly do have problems internally, but those are papered over by a very strong central government that's able to kind of use force where needed to force their people to adhere to the will of the central party in Beijing. We don't have that problem. We have a different problem here, which is that we are decentralized and we have a lot of internal disputes that a foreign actor like China is able to take advantage of and get us to fight amongst each other. Some of the things that Gordon talked about. A critical issue here is that we speak often, and Gordon wrote a great book several years ago about this. We speak often about the internal contradictions of China and how that could be the seeds of its own destruction. And I think it very well could be over the long term. I think the problem with us is that we never look inward, and we have also here the seeds of our own destruction. And we've seen it over the last 4 years, really, where our democracy, our open society has really fragmented to the point where now you have at least a bifurcation internally where we can't get anything done. I'm reminded of last year when the COVID-19 pandemic broke out. There was a sect of people, and I was among them, who said, hey, we need to look at China's biotech development because this thing could have come from a lab. President Trump, former President Trump, said this could have come from a lab. And yet, because he said it, half the country didn't believe him. Half the country wouldn't even give him the time of day. That is a structural weakness of our own that, if we're not careful, could take us down. Where I think we're going is I think the next 20, 30 years will be defined by a conflict between the forces of greater centralization, as represented by China's system, and the forces of decentralization, nominally represented by the United States and the West. Now, decentralization works in the modern age if it's kind of a distributed network approach, where you have a central coordinating authority that can kind of coalesce when we have a shared threat and distribute where the resources where they need to go to fight that central authority that we're resisting, let's say in China. China doesn't have the ability to sort of delegate. Everything has to be done through the central authority in Beijing, otherwise they can't trust it. So that is a weakness that they have that we should be able to exploit, but we've got to get our own house in order. And so, my concern is that for the next 4 years, you're going to have a lot of internal fighting, a lot of political gamesmanship within Washington that's going to prevent us from being able to develop high-tech R&D to stay ahead of China. All we need to do right now, what I say in my book, a minimum of $1 trillion investment from the federal government into research and development, high tech, so that we can do what we did in the previous century, in this century, invest in quantum, invest in biotech, invest in new space technologies. That will keep us ahead of China so that they can't do anything to us. Because right now, they're throwing everything they can into these industries, and they're able to at least keep a pace with us. And eventually, my concern is they will be able to leapfrog us.
Well, thank you for that. Martin, over to you. And if you can perhaps, as discussing the same issues, give us your take on the sustainability, which both our colleagues here have alluded to, of this ostensibly very successful dirigiste model, right? That's all top down, that Beijing orders things and can devolve, basically unlimited capital to whatever investments they want to get into, and have the biggest solar industry in the world, the biggest electric car industry in the world, the biggest telecom manufacturer in the world, which is Huawei, and all that. Is this as you look at Martin, the strengths and weaknesses, is this sustainable? In other words, can you have an innovative society which is autocratic innovation? Does that work?
It works in jumps and starts, but not in the long run. We have seen this twice in classic examples in the last century, in the examples of Nazi Germany and the example of the Soviet Union. In both cases, technological and breakthroughs in military dominance appear to be breathtaking in the short term, far in advance of us. But in both cases, they failed to develop in the most, what turned out to be the most crucial areas, both economically and militarily. And I see the same potential in China. And they are not supermen on one hand. On the other hand, 1.3 billion highly intelligent, motivated people are much more formidable, you could argue, than Superman. But their government system is hugely flawed and has made catastrophic mistakes, which are never referred to in the mainstream. Gordon especially has done yeoman's work. I think you're our Superman, Gordon, because you've really been alone in pointing so many of these things out for so long. Their financial sector from Shanghai could collapse at any time. Again, I cite Gordon's work on this. Just as Lenin was able to rely on the useful idiots of Western capitalism, Henry Ford and others for such long periods of time, the Chinese have been artificially propped up with a system that is catastrophically corrupt, and I'm talking about the financial system, and is extremely weak for them. Because of the weakness of the Shanghai system, because of the lack of transparency and honesty, they do not have an efficient business growth sector. Again, Gordon has done the crucial work that there are statistics of growth which are mindlessly believed in the West, just as Soviet figures are fictional. They're simply not true. But there are much more fundamental issues involved here. The impact of global warming. The north of China has suffered drought conditions in 75% of 3/4 of the years over the past 20 years. Agricultural growth is at a standstill in the north of China. They have been able to avoid any significant hardship because of their industry and success in mass industrial exports. They do have this still enormous, $1 trillion plus balance of payments, again, helped by our own stupidity since the time of Bill Clinton in opening our own economy. But they've had to buy food for that. And as I've done work on, they basically have had to buy up much of the best, most productive farmland in Africa and large quantities of productive land in South America, and importing food on an enormous basis from there. And that in turn makes them strategically vulnerable because they have a long jugular vein. Just as Britain could only survive in both world wars by virtue of the United States and Canada supplying the food, oil, and other raw materials that Britain desperately needed for survival against Germany in 2 world wars, China, even in terms of peace, actually survives because of the protection of the United States Air Force and Navy in the Indian Ocean, guaranteeing the secure sea routes to China. And we do not leverage this. We have never leveraged this. A second point is they are vulnerable to internal disorder in 2 key areas: Hong Kong, which they're hypersensitive about, and the Uyghurs, of course. And I do not personally advocate trying to destabilize China, because that sets up an existential threat with a thermonuclear power. But we don't have to. We should be able, for the very points that Gordon makes, the fentanyl issue, the issue of deliberately trying to destabilize and encourage radical groups on our own streets. All we really have to do is to show them quid pro quo. We can do to you far worse than you have been trying to do to us. And if we were serious about that and sustained about that, which of course we have not been and are not now, but if we were, we could stop that in its tracks. The last point I would make here is they are not an adaptive system. Their first solution to global warming and the loss of sufficient natural water in the north of China, eventually they found a short-term solution, but again, it's not sustainable in the long term. And that's basically buying out Africa and importing vast quantities of food, which makes them vulnerable in any time of conflict. That's the only solution they've managed. In the short term, they tried the National Water Carrier Project, and it was an environmental and economic and engineering catastrophe and failure. And I end with this point, and it's crucial. their planners at heart are still hydro engineers and communist planners.
Yeah.
They thinking in the long term is not their strength. It is their greatest weakness, because as John Maynard Keynes said, in the long term, we are all dead. The greatness of our system is Wall Street, and is our adaptability, our apparent childishness and being able to, which is a tremendous strength, adaptability, being able to turn on a dime. They are ahead of us in solar power. I don't think the future is going to be in solar power. They are ahead of us with Tesla. I'm very skeptical about Tesla, and some of the best business analysts I know are too. We are going to be moving ahead with clean technologies, but they will probably develop in unexpected areas that are in front of our eyes now, but have not quite yet reached critical mass yet. But the Chinese have invested too big, too soon in fashionable areas. And of course, they'll blame us when they get it wrong, but we will be able to adapt much more quickly than they will.
Well, thank you, Martin. Gordon, back to you regarding at least the how can I say, the broad contours of what seems to be the Biden administration approach, which is to say, well, Mr. Trump, whatever he did, he was kind of doing it solo, okay? He was concentrating on attacking China, this and that, and focusing perhaps not on the right targets, which was the trade surplus, maybe not really understanding or at least bringing up all the other attendant problems. And at the same time, he was attacking all the allies. He had trade wars with Europe, with Japan, with South Korea, with Canada, China, Canadian steel being obviously a threat to American national security, as it was portrayed in the Trump administration. And Biden said, we're going to do it different. We want to work with our allies. We want to have a united front. In principle, this sounds great. In practice, is this doable? Are we going to have the kind of strength and support from Europe, which is always wobbling and this and that? And of course, they've done their deal with China, at least on paper, last year. In other words, can we take comfort in this new approach to say, wait a minute, we're going to lay out this very carefully, and then we will go against China as a Western bloc, from Portugal to South Korea, we're all united. Is that a strategy, or is this just talk?
I think that it is a strategy, but it's a very difficult to implement strategy, because you're dealing with countries which they believe they've got interests different than ours. I mean, we're Americans, so we know everybody's interest. And we, for instance, have told this to the Chinese so many times what their interest is. But other countries don't see it that way, as you've mentioned, Paulo. The thing I think is important, you start to look at Europe, and Europe right now is in a quandary. It's got so many internal challenges. It is sort of flailing about. You referred to the comprehensive agreement on investment, which Europe and China announced just days before Biden took the oath of office. Now, I think that that's more like just a memorandum of understanding. It may never actually be implemented as a formal agreement, but the point is it shows you where European leaders are going. Now, I think that there are some countries in Europe that will follow American leadership. So for instance, Britain will, some of the Eastern European countries will, who knows where else. But the point right now is this has always been a question of American leadership. You go back to the Cold War. Europe and the United States had interests which were very common and very close, which was to deter Soviet Union. And yet it was very difficult for Reagan and others to get the Europeans to agree on practical steps to deter the Soviets. Now it's a bit more difficult for a number of reasons, some of which you could at least, let's say, blame Trump for, but most of them not. And so I think Biden is going to find, like Trump did, that this is ultimately going to be an issue of American leadership. Just one side point. For Biden, who has been complaining about Trump's undermining US alliances, what does he do on his first day in office? Well, he cancels the Keystone XL pipeline without consulting Ottawa, our closest ally. at least our closest ally in terms of geography, which
Right.
we have a border of what, 2,000 miles, which is undefended.
Yep.
I mean, this is more just, I think, you know, in some ways, some talk on the part of Biden, because if you're really serious about working with allies, what we're going to have to do is to have those hard discussions, and we're going to have to delay taking actions until we get everybody on board. As a practical matter, I'm not sure that that's the way this is going to eventually work out. And one simple point, and that is, China's just not going to give us the time, the luxury of time to get everybody on board. And we're going to have to take measures to defend ourselves. Biden will eventually understand that. The American people will eventually understand it. And we're going to have a strategy which in substance is going to look very much like Trump's strategy. There may not be the corrosive rhetoric that Trump had, but nonetheless, it's going to be the same policies, because Trump's policies with regard to China and with regard to our allies were actually quite good. And I know that both Marty and Brandon can talk much better about this than I did, but we can see that Trump has actually done a number of things very important, getting our allies on board, and Biden will do basically the same thing Trump does, maybe with different words, but with the same substance.
Yeah.
Let me follow up, Martin. I want to ask you a question here, because this is just in the news, and in terms of modifying the or not the flavor, the atmosphere, the temperature. I'm sure you know very well that in the UK, the broadcasting controller, I forgot what, Ofcom, I think is the name of the office, that they have withdrawn CGTN license to operate in the UK, right? So CGTN, Chinese broadcaster, no longer on the air in the UK. And a few days later, guess what? The BBC lost its license to broadcast in China. Okay, is this just a small, needling, or is this more, or can this portend to something else? In other words, what the British authorities said, this is not a genuine broadcaster. This is just a tool of state propaganda. Okay, and therefore it doesn't meet our standards, and therefore we would withdraw their whatever license to operate, whatever the technical term is. And then the Chinese say, no more BBC. Can we see more of this? And if that is so, how significant is this in the changing of the atmosphere globally between China and the West?
I think it's a strong wind. It has to be put in context. Gordon made the key point before, which applies here, which is that Britain is very much in our corner here. But most of the major Western European nations, in terms of dealing with China, manifestly are not. I'm not in favor of these moves in general, partially because selfishly, I flourish by explaining the Chinese and the Russians to America and the US to the Chinese and the Russians. So the more that the BBC and CGTN and Russian and US outlets are allowed to talk to each other, the more selfishly, personally, I'm in favor of it. But there are more serious issues involved here. And a crucial one is, as Winston Churchill loved to say, jaw, talking, diplomacy, communication, understanding is much more important than war. What the British have actually done is help the Chinese, because the BBC, Hong Kong was a British colony for almost 160 years, up to 1997. The BBC had major access there, more so than any other English language media. What Johnson has done in a typically panic-stricken and ill-thought-out move is give the Chinese a perfect excuse to shut down the BBC and to shut down BBC coverage in Hong Kong at the very time when it was most needed. The context, in the political and strategic context for the British, is very different from either Europe or from the US. The British have disastrously bungled the Brexit, their exit from Europe, in the most inept manner imaginable. Joe Biden, from his perspective, is a perfectly understandable distrust of Boris Johnson, who one should remember he had to deal with as a major figure in Britain for quite a number of years when he was vice president. Johnson knows this. And for the British to be so idiotic as to bait the Chinese at the very same time, they have terrible relations with the Europeans. The new president of the United States, who does not share President Trump's protective support for them, is extreme, from their point of view, is extremely short-sighted. So this is an outlier issue. But you're right, of course, in the broader sense, Polo, because it is quite feasible that we will be cutting, saying the same thing to the CGTN, and that if so, they will certainly respond against us, not just against VOA, but probably NBC and our commercial outlets in Beijing as well. And again, I'm against this because even when our coverage of China is highly superficial and naive, which it usually invariably is, it's better than nothing. And the more excuse we give them to crack down and go back to totalitarian behaviors of pattern, which can reassert them, or have reasserted themselves, as Gordon documents all too easily, the more we are playing into their hands. So in this particular area, you're right, Polo, it is a straw in the wind. It is highly significant, but I don't think it's in our interest in the longer term. If you look at the collapse of the Soviet Union, communist and totalitarian systems decay when their people are exposed more to what the reality of the world
sorry, Mark,
is.
Sorry to interrupt. Somebody in the audience is asking if you can raise your volume. Is it possible?
I hope so. Hang on. Let's take a look here.
Apparently, the audio is not particularly, it's not optimal.
My apologies. I'm not sure. I'll talk even louder, which is not hard for an Irishman to do, you understand.
I think it's better. Okay, sorry.
I'm talking a little closer, so there is that. But again, I've talked too much as usual, so let me pass back to the others.
Okay, Brandon, let me ask you this. You mentioned before about, obviously the relationship between strategy and technology and all that. And also you were saying, we have an open system. We've got all these Chinese students in the United States, which is, I think, by far the largest contingent, if I'm not mistaken, of foreign students, surpassing any other. Do you foresee changes here as we understand more deeply that many of these students are very often agents, whether willing agents or blackmailed agents, whatever they may be, but forced to do intelligence work for their handlers back in China? And that's a reality, right? We closed the consulate, allegedly in Houston, was that?
Yeah.
In order to stop those some of that trafficking. So how do you see that happening? Number one, if that's significant, and two, do you think, as Martin expressed skepticism as to the sustainability of this enormous top-down effort led by Beijing to say, okay, guys, here is, I don't know, $100 billion, go invent this for me by tomorrow. Is that, you said, at the moment, it's strong enough and it may really cause serious problems for us, but how do you see that evolving? In particular, looking at if you share Martin's and also Gordon's concerns, that the system is strong but brittle.
Yeah. Let me just start out by saying I've had some contact with the Biden team, particularly the Office of the Vice President, and it sounds to me like there is a bit of a war going on within the administration. Now, we're told team of rivals is great. But the problem with that is if you don't have a leader at the top with a vision to, overcome the bickering, you're just going to be stuck in the mud, as it were. And so in terms of where we're going to go, for instance, with dealing with all of the student issues where we have a large number of Chinese expatriates coming here to study, and not all of them are just coming to study. Many of them are, in fact, going to be used as conduits for the Chinese regime to get their hands on technology and research and to sort of gain access to individuals in the West who are doing cutting edge research and development. We don't know how those policies will play out. We know in the previous administration, where there was a commander-in-chief who was very much dedicated to rolling back China's gains.
Yes.
We know that there was a consistent attempt to stop this sort of shenanigans going on with Chinese students. Under Biden, we had this comment yesterday he made in the Oval Office where he said, if we're not careful, China's going to eat our lunch, which of course is a complete reversal from what he was saying during the campaign, which was sort of minimizing the rhetoric around China's threat to us. There is definitely a battle going on within this administration between sort of the hawks, people like Kurt Campbell, and also the the doves, if you will. I don't know how that's going to play out. It's just going to be an ongoing thing. And as that internal battle is shaping up, there's going to be some holdover because of inertia from the Trump years. But my concern is going forward, we won't have a direction. The president can say whatever he wants, but what is the action? What are we doing at the implementation level? And so here's what China's doing. China has a vision. They have a strategy. They have it tethered to ends, ways, and means.
Yeah, agreed.
They don't want to fight us in a straight up combat. They don't want to fight us in a war yet. What they want to do is suck us dry. And they're not just using Chinese students, for instance, to pilfer the knowledge. When my wife was at Yale, I tell audiences this all the time. My wife was studying genetics at Yale. Her cohort of fellow PhD students, both ethnic Chinese and non-Chinese, my wife is from Virginia, so she's not Chinese, but she was being accosted over the email by Chinese firms. Come over to Shanghai, come to Shenzhen, come to Wuhan, create a advanced genetics lab, do your genetic research here. We'll pay off your student loans. We'll pay you 7-8 figures to do the research. Just do it all here. Uproot and go. A lot of her cohort did this. She didn't, obviously, being married to me, but a lot of her cohort did this, if anything, to pay down their student loans, and which is a national security problem, by the way. So it isn't just even Chinese students that we have to worry about. It's the fact that our system does not fundamentally operate in a sort of national security environment. Our education department doesn't think this way, understandably. The Chinese do. And so that's an issue going forward. And I'm seeing Marty. Do you want to jump in, Marty? Is that?
No, finish first, Brendan. I want to follow on from you after.
Sure, I'm just coming to a close here. But
continue.
But basically, so really it's contingent, our response, on how the internal dialogue in the Biden administration shapes up. And we know that Biden has 40 years of being soft on China. So my hope here is that enough of the Kurt Campbell types and the Eli Ratners can get through to Biden, and that he's seeing these intelligence briefings on just what the Chinese are doing, what they're planning on doing, and how they plan on using the advanced technology they're getting in China against us. And that he'll come around. Now, the problem is timing, as Gordon alluded to. China's going all ahead. They don't full speed ahead. They're not waiting for us. And so in the meanwhile, we're kind of figuring out what to do at the reset level. Beijing's moving ahead, and it's only going to take them 10 to 15 years, I think, to leapfrog us. How dynamic they are? Well, just look at Shenzhen. Shenzhen is a dynamo. It started out as what we call an imitation cluster, where all they were doing in the 80s and 90s were imitating cell phone production. Now Shenzhen is the hub of Huawei. It's where 5G was created, really. They're doing 6G research. Go to the local market in Shenzhen. It is an incredible thing to experience. I've spoken to people who go there, where you have all these little engineers, they're these individual engineers who want to create the next thing. So they're buying all the technology on the street that are for sale, all this holdover tech, and they're innovating off of that. And then they're trying to win government money to do this. It's very sustainable because China wants it to be sustainable. Right now, we don't have a federal level R&D program like we used to have, the kind of program that built modern telecommunications, that built out the modern Silicon Valley, that built out the atomic weapons program, that built out Apollo moonshot program. We can get there though, but it's going to require presidential leadership. I can't stress that enough. And the one thing that we have going for us, it sounds like, is at least half of the foreign policy team for Biden are as seriously committed to standing up to China, at least on paper, as the previous administration was. So all it's going to take, I think, is China overstepping, which they're already starting to do.
Martin, before I hand it over to you, I want to also lay out, because also time is pressing here, I want to ask this question, which I think Brandon is getting to it. I mean, as everybody knows, this is ancient history. We had our Sputnik moment, right? Many, many years ago. When the Soviets launched the first satellite, we were struck. We said, oh my God, they've got the satellite and they've got an ICBM, all right? And we don't. And then saying, we have to redo everything, overhaul education, strengthen our curriculum in science and whatever, physics, whatever we need to do, because we're behind. We got to catch up because the Soviets seems to be, excellent in research and whatnot. Are we going to have the 21st century equivalent of a Sputnik moment? And as
we've already had it. We've already had it. 5G. Now they're working on 6G. I talk about this in my book. We've had quantum computing. Google says they had quantum supremacy, but it's going to be a football being tossed back and forth. And so China's also got it now. And so they can build off that and spin off technology. Look at the quantum issue, right? From quantum computing, the Chinese now have a rudimentary quantum radar, which could potentially see our advanced stealth planes, render stealth obsolete. With that, they can tie it to their Russian-built S-4 and S-500 anti-aircraft missiles and basically prevent us from being able to interdict to save Taiwan or to protect the South and East China Seas.
But what I'm
You've got a series of those things that we haven't woken up to yet. It's a cultural problem.
That's what I'm saying. I mean, the Sputnik moment led the Eisenhower administration to have the alarm bells. Then we had, the moonshot speech by President Kennedy in, was it 1962?
1962.
Yes. And what the moonshot say? So we can do this. And he was very articulate. He said that, it's a challenge, it's complicated. We have no idea really how to do this, but I believe that if we have the fortitude and the resilience and the determination, we can do this. And 7 years later, we did it.
That's right.
That was not a small thing.
No.
In other words, do we need something like that? As we had the sort of all of government thing to develop the COVID vaccine, right?
Right.
The Warp Speed project.
That's right.
Let's all do it. And we did it.
That's right.
But we don't have it. It seems to me we don't have it. I want to hear from all of you here, starting with you, Gordon. We don't have this sense of we're losing ground and these guys indeed are eating our lunch. And this is more than just an economic unpleasantness, because this means shifting the global balance of power. Gordon, what do you think? Do we need that? Do we need Biden to give a speech to say, we are, at a crossroads here? And these guys not only are, as you say, malicious, but they have tools. And if we don't watch out, well, we will not have the necessary tools to fight this battle. Gordon.
Yeah, I agree. We have not had a Sputnik moment with regard to technology. And Brandon was talking about Rice University, the September 1962, where Kennedy said, we choose to go to the moon. And I think that's what Brandon was referring to.
That's right.
We haven't had that yet. And, if you look at COVID-19, Paulo, you pointed out, yes, we developed 2 vaccines that are 95% effective, which are really quite innovative. We got the Johnson & Johnson one coming down the stream. We did this. China, for instance, they had months of head start. And they still have a vaccine which is at best 65% effective, maybe 35% effective is one of their vaccines. And their vaccines haven't been proven safe. So this really shows the strength of the U.S. system. But I don't think we have had that moment where we say, holy crap, these guys are really ahead of us. And that's for any number of reasons, including both Russia and China trying to continue to divide us. So we do need that moment that Brandon was talking about, where the President of the United States goes to Rice and says, we're going to do this in quantum computing, 5G, all the rest of it. We have an educational system right now that is not suited for competition in the 21st century. We're a society that is still recovering from COVID-19, and very well, it may take longer than we think. So we're very focused on getting through this vaccine. Now, one thing that I'll just say, leave it on an optimistic note. No society is going to recover from this disease until it has effective and safe vaccines. And so far, we're the only country that has them. So we eventually will get this right. As Marty was talking about, China looks a lot more fearsome than it actually is. They don't have the vaccines. They won't have access to them unless they want to pay Pfizer or Moderna or Johnson & Johnson for that matter. So we probably will bumble our way through this. And I think that our formula for success very well may end up being just out-surviving those guys. But we won't have that political leadership that we had in the Reagan era or in Kennedy's era or Eisenhower. So that's the thing that troubles me the most, that we have not, Paula, had that Sputnik moment. We haven't had our 1957, and we desperately need it.
Well, it might really quickly, it might be the Chinese putting a flag on the moon or Mars that gets us to that point. And that would be very sad, but that may be what it takes.
Well, hopefully, I don't know, maybe the people in the Biden White House are listening to us today and they say, hey, there's a thought, memo to the president, Sputnik speech. Really, wouldn't that be nice? Martin, you, please.
Yes, thank you. I think, again, we go back to the analogies from the 50s and 60s, and there's much more to learn from them. Because first of all, it was not Eisenhower, a two-term president, former Supreme Allied Commander, the man who did approve us catching up with the Soviets and ICBMs, which we had done already by 1958. He was not the man who woke us up. It took a young, dynamic, next generation, photogenic, charismatic president.
Right.
The person we might want to look to here right now, and the person we might most want to engage on these issues, is Vice President Harris. She's a clean slate on national security issues. This can be good as well as bad. She doesn't have 20 or 30 or 40 years of baggage in the Senate or in national security issues behind her. And she is vice president to a 78-year-old president whose mind is certainly very clear and very there. As an Irishman myself, I recognize the president's very cool Irish-American political intellect, which was first class throughout the campaign. But this lady may well be the Democratic candidate for president 4 years from now. And even before that, it is perfectly feasible she may be president before that. And even without that, the pattern of the presidency since Bill Clinton has been that vice presidents have an increasing amount of executive power, especially in space and high-tech issues, even if they don't have backgrounds in them before. So Vice President Harris and her people should certainly be engaged as a priority on this issue. But also, she's a wonderfully effective speaker when she focuses on it, and she's young and she's attractive and she's dynamic. Charismatically, she's the person to make these points. The one other point I'll make is, in one sense, we have had our Sputnik moment. And that is, Gordon is right, of course, there wasn't a wake-up call. Actually, I don't think even them putting their flag on Mars or the moon will do it, because we have a generation of kids, like my kids, for whom Star Wars is a much greater reality than anything that actually happens in the solar system or in space. And I don't approve of that, but that's the way it is, right? Even with young adults. But we had our wake-up moment when they bungled and let the COVID virus disrupt the whole world and failed to disrupt it. We see that in the administration. We see that in the president's own comments. They alienated their own traditional friends who were well disposed towards them for decades and generations. And this was a wake-up call across America. And we actually have, as everyone here has pointed out, we have more than the beginnings of a national consensus on the very fact that you saw rightly, Paolo, the need to hold this panel on this issue reflects the degree to which we are responding to a national consensus that is already emerging on this issue. And they don't see that, just as they are brittle and they paper over all their own enormous potential cracks and flaws in their system. They fail to see how repeatedly after Pearl Harbor, after Sputnik, after President Kennedy's Rice speech, again and again through modern history, we confound the world by coming together in consensus after periods of intense debate and division. And I think we have the potential for that now. It doesn't guarantee it will happen, but we do have the positive potential for it.
Let me ask all of you, again, we're getting close to the end of our allocated time, but a critical issue which we cannot ignore, and that clearly is both substantive and emotional, which is Taiwan, of course, right? And clearly, China has been making a lot of noise about the fact that the usual story: Taiwan is renegade province, it's China, whatever. Don't interfere. This is a domestic affair. And right now, starting, with the last months, really, of the Trump administration, where there've been, clearly many gestures, which obviously do not equal to diplomatic recognition of Taiwan, but meeting with government officials, and of course increased military presence in the Straits. How do you see this? Is this something that are the Chinese tempted to do something really bad? Are we going to see an attack against Taiwan or other forms of more direct coercion aimed at subduing, the recalcitrant province? Or is this going to be a testing ground of this new adversarial situation in which the Biden administration put some markers and said, no, we will not tolerate this, and if you do something, watch out. How do you see this? This is really complicated, as we know. But Gordon, what do you see happening on Taiwan?
I think the administration's response to Taiwan is really the most hopeful thing that I've seen so far. For instance, we've got to remember that they sent the John McCain, an Arleigh Burke destroyer, through the Taiwan Strait. And then it did a freedom of navigation exercise in the Paracels. We now have 2 carrier strike groups in the South China Sea, the one built around the Theodore Roosevelt, the other, the Nimitz. Biden actually invited Taiwan's top diplomat to his inauguration, which something that hadn't been done since the 1970s. And China's going to help in this regard because on the January 23, they sent their nuke-capable H-6K bombers on a practice attack on the Theodore Roosevelt strike group. That is a message that was unavoidable. Now, I would have liked to have heard Biden actually say something about this from the Oval Office, but nonetheless, the sending of the Nimitz to join the Theodore Roosevelt, I think was an extremely good sign. So things are moving in the right direction with regard to Taiwan. Taiwan's important because not only is it at a strategic location where the South China Sea and East China Sea meets, First Island chain and all the rest of that, but it's also at a time where China's attacking democracy and attacking our democracies, and we cannot afford to let any democracy fall to China. So I think, I'm not close to the Biden administration as Brandon is, but I would think that they're coming around pretty fast on this. Mm-hmm. And this is one, as I said, this is to me the most hopeful sign that the Biden team will have a robust China policy. It's the reaction on Taiwan.
Great, Brandon, coming to you. How do you view, again, all this has just started, so it's hard to make predictions. the Pentagon review on China. I mean, it looks like this Secretary of Defense is a pretty, hard-nosed guy. He
Yeah.
wants to look at things thoroughly.
Yeah.
Do you see hope in this, or it's just going to be yet another?
No, yeah, no, I definitely, it seems like it's a game right now of inches. So, there is a little bit of progress. My concern with the Biden administration was that it was going to be sort of a complete reversal of what came before, and that's not happening yet.
Exactly.
But in terms of the Taiwan situation, I do think China is getting ready to do something big against Taiwan. I think that they feel the pressure. I think they were hoping that Biden would back down. He hasn't really indicated that he would, for the reasons that Gordon just mentioned. And so I think they're getting ready to do a big test of Biden to see decisively if he will do something. Something to watch out for is, while China does not actively court direct war with the United States, a lot of what's going on, what the Israelis refer to as the gray zone, the space between war and peace, a lot of that now is getting so brazen that it will eventually, very soon, end up in war. And so in order to attack Taiwan in any meaningful way, China's going to have to do a sustained cyber war campaign. Not only are they going to have to do information war or propaganda war, but they're going to have to do cyber war. And they're going to have to also then hit American and allied space assets in a space Pearl Harbor event, which they could very easily do, and we are not prepared for yet. And so this thing could end up being a test that goes way wrong, and now we're in a world war situation. If you take out the satellites, if you knock out our cyber capability, as you know, you've rendered American forces deployed over the horizon deaf, dumb, and blind, and then maybe China has a real shot of taking out Taiwan. So this is sort of the concern that I have is maybe Biden needs to be a bit more forceful than he is, but certainly we've made, I think, better moves than I thought we would.
Very quickly, gentlemen, Belt and Road, there's a little bit of track record now, to see. I'm asking all of you, starting with you, Martin, how well is this going? In other words, this is supposed to be this grandiose plan of Chinese-funded infrastructure that would tie in this sort of nefarious web that would get everybody, snatched in Central Asia, of course, and beyond, all the way down to Europe and Africa, etc. Does this have traction, or is this just this trap of debt and inconclusive things that don't really happen and too expensive? How do you view this? And everybody, I would like to hear.
It's an enormous debt. It can work for the Chinese by trapping nations in China's web like a Venus flytrap, because for the reason you said, Polo, because people get pulled into the debt trap. And once they're in the debt trap, as the Pakistanis have particularly found to their cost, it's almost impossible to climb out of it. Though, of course, the price the Chinese pay is enormous resentment with the ruling classes they deal with, not to mention resentment among the publics at large. But no, I don't believe that is sustainable in the long term. The more money they pour into it, the less results they seem to get. I have been monitoring for 20 years Chinese-Russian economic cooperation. And the political will is definitely there. The bold declarations are always made, yet nothing happens, or more usually impressive theoretical bureaucratic structures are set up. Huge problems are faced on the ground, and in business terms, they can't adapt to it. The Russians, and to a much greater degree the Chinese, are still caught in a post-communist trap. They don't have a truly free and responsive stock market that is free to cut its losses, turn on a dime, pour vast resources into things like fracking that didn't exist 2 years before. They're not adaptive. They have dug a hole for themselves here, and it keeps getting deeper. Now, there have been positive strategic aspects for them, and I wouldn't put the investment in Africa this way. That's a completely different kind of thing. And there are 1 million Chinese living in Africa. The Chinese now have a more permanent presence in Africa than the British and French empires did for 100 years. And we have been completely asleep at this, and we need to wake up to it. And India is our natural counterweight to China in the development of Africa, which we really need up to wake up. We have a lot of potential leverage there. But as far as Belt and Road goes, no, the more they invest in it, the more they lose.
Gordon, what's your take on this?
Yeah, I agree with Marty. I worry a lot about China. I don't really worry too much about Belt and Road, because really what they're doing is they're building all the infrastructure that the private market would not fund.
Exactly.
So they're ending up with a lot of projects which really make very little sense from an economic point of view. They make sense from a geopolitical point of view, but they probably have got they're overcommitted. Anyone who wants to put $60 billion into Pakistani infrastructure, I'm saying go for it, because you're going to lose that money. Just a couple points. There are one thing that we really, I think, is very good for us, and that is the belt portion of the Belt and Road, which is the rail and highway network through Central Asia, is going to become obsolete when the Northern Sea Route across the north coast of Russia opens up, as it is already. So that really makes all those investments through the Central Asian countries irrelevant, at least from a U.S. China to Europe point of view. The one thing that worries me about Belt and Road is that China is putting something like $3.4 billion into Freeport in the Bahamas, which is 87 miles east of Palm Beach. That could end up being a Chinese military base. That, of course, concerns me. But I think that the forces of economics, as Marty was talking about, are going to do the Chinese in well before we see a Chinese destroyer pull into the Bahamas.
Yeah,
Brendan, this would have to be the last point.
Yeah, I agree with what Gordon and Marty said. I would say the Belt and Road Initiative is something that I would not ignore. I think that they're putting it on hold, and they're going to see what happens. But the investments into Africa, the investments into Latin America, into the Bahamas, as Gordon said, those are the things that worry me. Also, the connection between China and Germany, in particular in Europe, that scares me. And also be watching for space cooperation between Russia and China, which is growing every day. And that should be very concerning to us, because that's how you have a real space war, is if China and Russia, with those two powerful programs, take on the United States, which looks like it could be happening.
Well, gentlemen, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Unfortunately reached the end of our time. Let's leave on a positive note that, again, if somebody's watching, we're waiting for the Biden or Harris, as Martin kindly suggested, moonshot speech, right? Or something equivalent that kind of will, we are kind of a problem solvers, right? That's what America is. Give us a target. And right now it's all rather amorphous. Maybe the administration can provide a good stewardship for all of us by providing a target. Say, this is what we need to reach. And I don't know if there is a moonshot equivalent, but maybe they can indicate something that will spur America's ingenuity and can-do spirit. And with that, I really thank you very, very much. And I am sure that we will have a chance to meet again, because this issue is not going away. So Gordon, Brandon, and Martin, thank you so much. And thank you, my good friend.
Great seeing you all.
Denise, who
thank you.
has, kindly put everything together as always. So thank you, Denise, and thank you, Principessa. Okay, we know what that is.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you and goodbye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.